morning or good afternoon. I never know quite what to say at this time of day, but very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, chief economist and CEO at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, deputy chief executive and director of studies, and she's back. Our special guest, for the second time running, we are delighted to welcome back Almut Möller, Director for European and Global Affairs and Head of the Europe in the World programme at the EPC. And this conversation, as we examine the extraordinary developments of the last few days, and particularly following Donald Trump's threats to take Greenland by force, his threat of tariffs on several EU member states, and then the dramatic U-turn in Davos. And we'll also be analysing the outcome of yesterday evening's emergency summit here in Brussels. So we have a great deal to discuss as we consider, was this a real test of Europe's credibility? And if so, did it meet that test? As always, totally interactive. I'll be asking our panel some questions. If you have any questions, either put them in the Q&A box in writing or click on the raised hands button and I will come to you. And as always, a request to be as brief as possible. So Janis, let me just come to you first and looking backwards, as it were. So where we got to last night, the summit was called after those threats from Donald Trump, and when asked, would you use force, he didn't rule it out. He then added to that the threat of tariffs on several EU countries for refusing to back his stance on Greenland. And then suddenly there was that dramatic U-turn on the use of force, on the tariffs. So why, in that case, did EU leaders feel the need to go ahead with the summit, given that it was supposed to discuss how to respond to all these threats?
Well, first of all, when we're talking about Donald Trump, I think one needs to be cautious when saying he made a U-turn because it might be the U-turn before the U-turn. You never know. As you said, this was an emergency summit, and I think it was the right reaction to the escalating Greenland crisis, so before Davos, because it was also the right thing to showcase determination, to showcase that we're ready to also meet, to discuss what our measures will be, countermeasures will be, to whatever he had signaled before Davos he might potentially be doing. So that was the right thing to do. Then there were some who said after Davos, why do we actually still need that summit? And I think that was the wrong assessment. Because for a number of reasons, that even though there was a de-escalation, given the deal that has been worked out, we still don't know all the details of it between the Trump administration and Mark Rutte. There are still unclarities with respect to how things will develop in future, whether the potential settlement will be reached when it comes to Greenland. We're not out of the woods yet, and there's a need to discuss of reactions or potential reactions in case there is another escalation to be prepared for it. Then there's also the lessons to be learned from that incident. There are still different readings within different capitals of what should have been done, what actually was done, and why, as you called it, the U-turn of Donald Trump happened. There are very different readings. Some say it's because there was strong pressure on him coming also from Europeans, plus other factors, and others arguing, no, it was the conciliatory way in which Mark Rutte handled it,
Yeah.
which actually led to a result. And then let's not forget, all that has repercussions for things which happen beyond Greenland. When it comes to Gaza, the board of peace, where it had repercussions when it comes to Ukraine. So there was a lot of things to discuss. The fact that they met for 5 hours, had intense discussion. It seems that everyone raised his or her voice and also talked for a long time, lengthy time, showcases that this was the right thing to have. They didn't take any concrete decision. This was a very informal meeting. It will come together again in February, and let's see what will be on the agenda. Then, besides the single market and competitiveness, given the situation, so there were ample of reasons to go to plan the meeting, and there was ample of reasons to have held it despite the U-turn, as you called it.
So, Almut, from your perspective, the fact that the summit went ahead, is that a sign? We've had EU diplomats talking about this as a Rubicon moment. I want to come back later to the broader implications, but saying things have changed. And we'll come back, Ursula von der Leyen talking yesterday about we know we have to work as an independent Europe. Was the fact that they decided they needed to have this summit, even though there was nothing urgent now to respond to, perhaps with the exception of the border peace issue, which we'll come back to, a sign that, yes, they are recognizing that this wasn't just an isolated crisis and that things have changed and they need to have a broader conversation about the relationship with America as a whole?
First and foremost, I can think of earlier moments in which Rubicons were crossed, but I believe if there is a realization now around tables that it has come now, that's very good and much needed. I've come to think of, these summits more in the sense of almost like cabinet meetings, things that are, not about protocol, but about aligning on key matters. And of course, there was a lot to align on, not to realign on, but to align on in the sense of the experience that each and every one around this table had over the past days and weeks, some more than others. And we are in a situation in which European leaders, especially the ones that have been put under so much pressure, as the Danish Prime Minister in particular, they carry so much responsibility and they need as individuals also the reassurance. After all those meetings that have been happening, some got to meet the president, a few of them, some didn't, a lot of them were speaking in various places. There are things happening with NATO leadership, etc. For these leaders to be able to convene around a table in an environment they know and hopefully have still enough trust, despite some question marks over everyone around the table, but to be able to meet and kind of share also the immense importance of working with peers, essentially. And this is something I have come to feel has not been acknowledged enough when talking about the European Council and the summit, because it sounds more like a sort of, diplomatic thing, everybody descending, huge delegations. It's very much about those leaders. I know the table has become very big, so it's not always that informal because the space creates certain sort of, dynamics. But I think it was very important to meet and to reassure each other that the path ahead is one, and here I agree fully with Janis, has a lot of, the great need basically for Europeans to come together in this way and take action, not against anybody, but as a renewed choice for Europe. And probably the past days have accelerated that because leaders have been exposed to that in quite unprecedented ways.
And I want to come back to what that choice is and whether you feel there has been a lot of talk that this has shown the EU united in its approach. Is this again a Rubicon moment? Because in a crisis, you can either tear apart or come closer together. The Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever said that in Davos this week. Do you think it's a sign that genuinely this is bringing them together? But we'll come back to that. Fabian, for you, was it a Rubicon moment? As Almut's saying, we've had several of those. So was it really? And we've been talking on Update. We used to call it the Zeitenwende after Russia invaded Ukraine. Is this really the moment when Europe wakes up to the fact that the world, as we thought it was, no longer is?
It is a little strange because when we look at what has been happening, not even since Donald Trump has come into office for the second time, but even in the run-up to that, then we shouldn't be surprised about what is happening at this moment in time. But yes, for many, it was a Rubicon moment. Not that they crossed the Rubicon, but that Trump crossed the Rubicon. And the reason for that is that the challenge to Greenland is so fundamental. Not in the sense that, of course, Trump could have made an argument about having greater control over resources, having more presence militarily. All of those things would have been perfectly normal. But this imperial approach of I want to own that territory, and I don't care whether the Europeans object to that or not, or for that matter, the Greenlanders. Who cares about those? But that was such a fundamental challenge to Europe that Europe had to react. And in that sense, we've been forced into a situation where we had to show more strength than we thought we had. But the big danger, and this is why I also think having this summit is necessary, and it is only the first of many of those to follow, this will come back. There is no question that in fundamental thinking, nothing has changed in the White House. There might be a tactical retreat at this moment in time, but these kind of challenges are the new normal now.
And you don't, I mean, we're talking earlier about that differing interpretations of why Trump U-turned. Was it this famous phrase, taco, Trump always chickens out, i.e. he's always marching his troops up and then he always backs down? Was it a reaction to the mounting pressure from the stock markets in the US? From, indeed, we're hearing now Republicans for the first time really beginning to say you've gone too far. Or was it, as EU leaders are trying to claim, all about the fact that the EU stood united, tough? I mean, Ursula von der Leyen said we followed 4 key principles: firmness, outreach, preparedness, and unity. And the Danish Prime Minister said, when Europe is not divided, when we stand together and when we are clear and strong, the results will show. I mean, how important is it? Do you think there is an alignment within the EU on what led to the U-turn? And if they say it was Europe being tough, were they right, Fabian? And then I come to you, Almut.
I think it is, of course, natural that our leaders now will emphasize their role in what has happened. This is also them playing to their domestic audience to say we were actually the ones who stopped this. I think the reality is, yes, Europe had something to do with it, but not as directly as is being implied. Neither the Rutte approach nor the more opposition approach. I think what changed his mind is what happened in domestic politics, because that is the measure of what matters to Donald Trump. And what he saw was that going further would not have been a vote winner in the US. It would have not helped him in addressing the challenges which was there. And in some ways, and this is where the European reaction comes in, it might have made things worse at home. Not only having some voices within his party, which were critical, but also if there is a trade war, then of course that has an impact also on price levels, and the cost of living, I think, is something he worries more about than what the Europeans are doing. So I think we had in some ways a lucky escape. I think if this had proven to be popular at home, he would have just carried on. But it doesn't mean he will stop. This is still a direction which is open because it fits with his mindset, with his ideology. The idea that he can own these places, that he can go down in history as an American president who added to the territory of the US. These are all things alongside the Nobel Peace Prize, which he's coveting for himself.
And some. I mean, in terms of does it matter whether EU leaders are right in their interpretation of why he backed down, Almut, and what implications it has? I mean, your sense really of beyond the tough words, beyond the Greenland is for Denmark and Greenland alone, and up with this we will not put. Do you think, given that fundamental challenge has for now receded, the typical thing with the EU is the immediate threat recedes, you suddenly don't have that sense of urgency. Do you think now that the EU was really contemplating extremely tough action and will not now say, phew, well, that's over for now, we can relax? Even if their rhetoric says we won't relax, do you think they might, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think for Europeans, ultimately, it doesn't matter what created a situation which, of course, for Europeans is one of relief to a certain extent. I mean, breathe, pause. This could have been much worse. What led to that ultimately, to me, is interesting to think about, but it is assuming that there is some rational action still. And, I cannot base as a European, my kind of strategizing of what needs to come next on this. So for Europeans, I think, regardless of what led to the situation, which is a very uncomfortable one, I mean, Europeans, in particular, of course, Denmark, we're facing a situation in which suddenly there is apparently a reopening of the 1951 agreement over Denmark, a negotiation. I mean, imagine, pause for a moment, this is what is happening now. And this is a situation that is far from being settled. For Europe, I think it is less important to think about how they received perhaps more attention for their interests, or the president decided differently. It's more important to think about how do we strengthen Europe, because we are vulnerable. Bart de Wever also said it very clearly in Davos. We don't want to be in the situation because we cannot afford to be in the situation. So for Europe, it's invest in strength at speed. And here I find encouraging, and that's your question, Jacki, that I think the instinct of European leaders at this point in time is really to take this very seriously, probably including those that find themselves in constituencies, domestic policy environment, and politics environment that feels more, further away from this, further away from Ukraine, further away from Europe's north, further away from discussions over Greenland. My sense is that the political glue of this group of people, minus probably a few, has been strengthened to the extent that it is not kind of a bomb is being thrown and the chickens are running in all directions. My sense is this has been understood. The tragic thing is that, I mean, one of the most tragic moments, and I just need to sort of get rid of that at the end of this week, for me, was Ursula von der Leyen presenting a calm speech in front of the Davos audience to say, this is how Europe is going strong. The French president said the same very concrete examples, also to an audience that by and large has to care about predictability, has to care about stability, because they have an interest in a world not going into chaos. And she praised and hailed Mercosur to then return to her own hunting grounds of, Strasbourg plenary to witness the vote that we've all seen.
Yeah.
And so
referring there to the Parliament's decision to refer it to the courts. Yeah.
Yeah. And here, I mean, this is one example of the European Union knowing what to do. European leaders had actually negotiated it. And then there are voids in political majorities in an incredible way. This should not have happened. And we know beyond sort of, the political discussions that there are also institutional reasons for this. So here is my biggest concern. While leaders would probably agree on this being Rubicon moment, we cannot go back. We need to take bolder, faster action. The politics of that is going to be very, very daunting.
Indeed. Janis, in terms of does it matter how you read the U-turn, but also your assessment of what we learned about how far EU leaders were prepared to go if Trump had not backed down, did you get a sense that now there would be a cost for this, and the cost would be different for different member states, depending on their economic ties with the US, depending on their defense dependencies on the US, and so on. Was your sense that member states were beginning to say, in the interest of standing up to this, in the interest of showing our determination, we are willing to pay potentially a political and economic price for the greater good and therefore for the good of us all? Or was your sense still, because there was some argument about people calling for the use of this so-called anti-coercion instrument, the trade bazooka, others saying, no, no, no. What's your sense of what we learned about how far European leaders would have gone if, as we say in English, push had come to shove?
Well, in many ways, it depends on how far Trump would have gone. This is the variable that, to a big extent, determines of how we react or how we would have reacted. So if he would not have done a U-turn in Davos, if he would not have excluded the use of force, that would obviously would have had to a different kind of a situation than the one we have now, even if it would be something in between. So it very much depends on how he acts. And that's one of the core problems we're having. We're still being reactive. I have my doubts that we have fully understood that we have crossed the Rubicon, that the shock therapy has been so strong that there is no alternative now to really understand what it takes to become independent. What Almut, you were alluding to with respect to Mercosur is just another indication of that. Have we really understood? And when I say we, I include the leaders, I include the EU institutions, I include MEPs, I include all the politics behind it. Also, some of the leaders maybe also actually not wanting the European Parliament to take the decision it should have taken or it did take, depending on which side they're on. So I am very doubtful that we have reached the moment where actually everyone has understood and we will do whatever is needed, whatever it takes. And by the way, also listen to the speech of Zelensky in Davos, where he was very critical of Europeans. And he was obviously referring to what happened in December with respect to the Russian assets. But he also had in mind what is happening currently or what happened in the case of Greenland. Now, with respect to the reasons behind why he actually made this U-turn or changed or allegedly changed his position, again, we do not know how actually he will stay where he is now or whether he will change his mind again. There are different reasons what I think led to that, and probably all of them played a role. The question is, what do we learn? What's the lesson learned? And I think the big lesson learned is he decides to do certain things if he feels that it is in his national internal interest, in his personal national internal interest. And if he sees that there is pressure, if he sees that there are divisions within the MAGA movement, so it's not about the traditional Republicans, its own power base, where if he feels that they're not in favor of potentially having an escalation of the crisis, of the Greenland crisis, that's when he reacts. And I think that's something we need to have in mind also when we progress in terms of the politics of all this. How do we affect? How can we play a role from the outside to make sure that the pressure in the US moves in the direction of which is in our interest?
Indeed, and
You
I want
play
to come.
politics.
Yeah,
And
I
by
want
the
to come
way,
back to that and what that means for what the EU needs to do in the future. Just staying with the summit for a moment, another issue that was on the table was this new so-called Board of Peace. This was discussed at the summit. There was an invitation to Ursula von der Leyen. There were invitations to individual member states, by the way, and I want to come back to Mark Carney's speech at Davos a bit later on, but Trump in the middle of the night saying, you're no longer invited to join my Board of Peace because you said mean things in Davos, a classic Trump moment. But Antonio Costa said afterwards, talking about the Board of Peace, quotes, we have serious doubts about a number of elements in the Charter of the Board of Peace related to its scope, its governance, and its compatibility with the UN Charter. He then talked about working with it, although not part of it, as on Gaza, but very much making it clear it's about Gaza, or it should be about Gaza, nothing else. Fabian, what is your sense? Many see this as an attempt to replace, to undermine NATO. It looks as if the EU decision for now is thank you, but no thank you. Is that the right decision? Should Europe shun it, both because of its nature and, frankly, its composition, a truly motley crew of dictators and autocrats and so on? Or, if Europe wants to be heard, does it need to take a seat at any table there is, even if the guests are unsavoury and the menu is as well? What's your sense of how the EU should have been responding to this? Have they got it right?
When we look at what is being created, I think we have to be clear about what is the function of this. So we can call it Board of Peace or we can call it whatever we want. It's essentially an instrument for Donald Trump to control what he thinks he needs to control. So I think it is right that Europeans are very skeptical about it. I would question whether you gain anything from being in the room, because I don't see that that will influence what Donald Trump will do. But I think the real question is not about the Board of Peace at all. It is about what kind of arrangements are we going to create in Europe to deal with the undermining of NATO, the undermining of our collective instruments which we have created. And we need to find an urgent answer to that, because what I think has also been a bit lost in this is I think it would be very hard to find people now who would be truly confident that when it comes to conflict, the US will be on the side of the Europeans.
Almut, from your perspective, Fabian saying, I doubt there's anything to be gained from being in the room. Antonio Costa, who I just quoted, did also talk about continuing to engage constructively with the United States. So would part of that constructive engagement to say, all right, we'll come to meetings of your board. I'm not sure about the $1 billion that you're supposed to give Donald Trump for the pleasure. And also, by the way, Trump made himself chairman for life. Interesting. Trump chairman for life, not the US president chairman for life. That's an aside. Your sense of the EU's response and whether they were right to say, we'll work with you, but we're not going to be part of it, certainly not now.
You might be surprised to hear my initial reaction to this, Jacki, since I'm a policy analyst, but I refer to the prophet Isaiah, who is quoted as peace resulting from the work of righteousness. And in the interpretation, I know that also includes justice. So long for what the Board of Peace of this kind can deliver on, as it does not entail any of that. I think it's important to see that, as you were referring to the European Council President's notes after the meeting, where he mentions it and mentions engagement, he ties it very closely on Gaza to the UN Security Council resolution on Gaza, which makes a very strong difference. I think it is advisable to ignore this for now and not, it's bad enough that there is European presence allegedly in this. And this is something that Europeans should be considering internally as yet another, rampant sort of violation of European unity. But for me, you give legitimacy to an institution, organization, gathering if you're giving it attention and presence. And my sense is if Europeans manage to be united in not giving it attention at this point in time, invitations have been extended to Vladimir Putin and also to Lukashenko. And, this is, I think, something to stay away from. But of course, the question for Europe, again, is not what's happening on the other side. The question is, what is it that we do, as Fabian was saying? What are our ideas in the Carney sense, not to mourn the old order, to say, what are we going to do? And part of this work, of course, has to start at home in Europe. Europe needs to accelerate fast on security competitiveness. Next European Council is going to look at that. And then it needs to fit that in, of course, with ideas of engaging with the world. And it was interesting
I want to come back on what we should do in a moment, if I might, Almut. If I could just hold you there for a minute, just to link this Board of Peace conversation also with Ukraine. You mentioned there the invitation to Vladimir Putin. There have been some suggestions that one of the things the Board of Peace could discuss is Ukraine. Seems extraordinary, but this is where we are. In terms of the Board of Peace, Janis, would you agree with what we've heard from Fabian and Almut? And also in terms of the implication of all of this for Ukraine. Trump met Zelensky yesterday. Be interested also in your take on Zelensky's speech in Davos, where he hit out incredibly strongly at the EU, talking about its inability, endless internal arguments and not being able to act. It loves to discuss the future, said Zelensky, but avoids taking action against Russia. Now, my thought was, well, he's right, or you would say certainly from previous updates, you'd agree with the sentiment, but was he wise to express it? How do you see the link between all of this and Ukraine? Is this an area where that unity of the EU that we've seen in the last few days feeds over into the Ukraine conflict and support for Ukraine. How do you see the link between the two?
Let me just start by referring to the Board of Peace. And I will put on my realist hat. Yes, we know what probably would be the best things for the EU, for the U27 to do. So we can provide advice about what should happen. But if you actually see what is happening and if you look into the crystal ball, what will happen, you already see that there are huge seeds of divisions among member states. And it's not only the fact that two EU governments were presented, meaning Hungary and Bulgaria. By the way, the outgoing Bulgarian prime minister, who's being internally very much criticized for that move, and the opposition arguing that he's betraying the interest of Bulgaria. But also, if you look into the position of other member states, especially those who still feel that we need to follow a conciliatory approach towards Donald Trump and try to engage those who are closer to the region, so the Greeks, the Italians, you feel that there is already a preparation to make sure we were not there. It was the right thing not to go, but we should find ways to get ourselves engaged. And yes, Costa said, and I'm quoting here, that the Board of Peace should be a mission as a transitional administration, but that's not in the mind of the American president or of Donald Trump, also after his presidency, as you were indicating. So there is a huge structural difference beyond the question as to whether this is undermining the United Nations, which is something which people are extremely critical about. But I already see that there are seeds of division within the EU, which I think will push them again in a direction which will raise big questions as to whether we are united. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, well, first of all, the crisis surrounding Greenland. One negative element of it is that it drew attention away from Ukraine. Because if you see what's happening in Ukraine every day, how many people on both sides, by the way, are being killed, there's a necessity to concentrate on Ukraine, and drawing attention away from that is not positive. Now, it seems that there is development with respect to the so-called peace plan. The Ukrainian side is satisfied with U.S. security guarantees. That was one of the big question marks they had, and they feel that they are satisfied, which, by the way, also has an effect, I think, on why he has been so critical of Europeans. But there is still this one big thorny issue with respect to territorial concessions. And the question is, I'm sure that the Ukrainians will not be ready to concede, also because that has military implications, not only territorial and sovereignty issues, but military implications for the future. And there's a big question mark whether Putin really wants a peace deal, and whether he is actually interested in it or not. Now, you were asking whether and how to interpret the critical tone that Zelensky had in Davos. I think that there are multiple reasons. One is, like in the cases we were talking earlier, he was also addressing national audience. There is a big frustration with Ukraine with respect to Europeans, and that was fostered by the December decision, or the lack of decision with respect to Russian assets. Then it was also directed towards Trump. Look, I'm being critical of Europeans, and with you, I'm able to strike a deal. So he still wants to make sure that he has Trump on his side. And then actually, he's critical of the Europeans because he thinks that we are shying away from taking the decisions which we say we would be taking, that we are independent enough, and then we don't dare to take certain decisions. And then that we're not doing whatever it takes to support Ukraine, that we do not do whatever it takes to prepare ourselves for a potential confrontation with Russia in order to avoid that confrontation, and that we're not assuming the responsibility we should be assuming. So I think there are multiple reasons why he has been so critical. And
But was it wise?
To tell you the truth, it is understandable. And we probably need this kind of, as I would call it, or we would call it, brutal honesty. By the way, also something Mark Carney was indicating, we need to be very honest about the situation in which we are. So showcasing how difficult it is, how dangerous it is, how many things Europeans still need to do, and if they are really serious that they've crossed the Rubicon, that they want to become independent, that they've understood that they cannot rely on the US. If all this is true, and he would argue, well, then you need to do ABC, and you're not doing ABC.
Thank you.
And
I
it's
want to
good
come
for
on.
him, and it's good that he's putting that the finger into our wound, because we're not living up to all that.
Okay, I want to come back to Mark Carney in a moment and consider the broader implications. And Almut, I will come back to you. What are we going to do? Point in a moment. But Fabian, you wanted to come in, I think, on this point about Zelensky.
I just wanted to add a nuance, because I think it's also important to recognize that while at the same time he's applying that brutal honesty to Europeans, he's not applying it to Donald Trump.
Because he feels he can't.
As he feels he can't. But that is a dangerous game to play.
Exactly.
Because the Europeans might well say, well, how dare you criticize us, given that you are in bed with Donald Trump when it comes to these issues. Now, that might not be said publicly, because clearly this is not something where you would want to have that public discussion. But I think what you're already seeing is a wariness when it comes to Ukraine, a feeling that maybe they are demanding too much. Maybe they are thinking of themselves a bit too much. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying I think there is also a political shift in the way Ukraine is seen.
Put it very simply, if you're picking sides, then why are you siding with the guy who does nothing for you instead of the people who are trying to help you and support you? I mean, put very, very simply. Yeah, this quick one, because I want to move on to the broader implications.
I think if we are, and I want to link it to what we were saying in the beginning, if this is a shock therapy which we're going through, and we understand what we need to do, and we understand that we need to be independent, that we have crossed the Rubicon, then we need to be ready to be self-critical of ourselves. And by the way, he wasn't using the honesty argument. It's, the brutal honesty we always say we need to put on the table when we analyze the situation. And it was Mark Carney who was saying, let's be honest about where we stand. It was not Zelensky. So if we, and I understand where you come from and I understand your logic, Fabian, but if we are not ready to accept someone who's critical of us for very good reasons, and actually we are arguing that we have understood that we need to handle the situation differently, then actually there's big question marks as to whether we have actually understood what we are saying in our Sunday speeches, that we have crossed the Rubicon and blah, blah.
Okay. I would love to continue this, but I want to come to the broader implications. And Almut, let me come to you first in terms of, we've referred to the speech by the Canadian Prime Minister, by Mark Carney, several times. It was an extraordinarily powerful speech, and I just want to give you a couple of little extracts from it if anyone hasn't read it or listened to it. He said, the old order is over and is not coming back. And he said, we're in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. He said, this calls for more than adaptation. It calls for honesty about the world as it is. He also, and I'd like to come to this in a moment, had some fascinating words to say about multilateralism. I'd like to come back on that if we have time before the end. But in terms of what he said, and he, by the way, it was a message of hope. It wasn't a message of despair, because he talked about middle powers like Canada, like countries the size of many EU member states, coming together. He said there is an alternative. It doesn't mean, he said we have a choice. We can compete with each other for favour or combine to create a third path with impact. Do you share his analysis? And when the EU looks at what it needs to do itself to prepare for this new world, or indeed that we're already in, what implications does it have? Did Mark Carney get it right in his diagnosis and his recipe?
Yes, it resonated with my thinking quite a lot. I have to say, I mean, we were looking at this in our outlook for the last year. And one thing we diagnosed was that Europe really needs to look at the world as it is and not as it wishes it to be, and needs to be able to do this shift of mindset. And what we can do as a think tank, and of course, that's our mission statement, we're trying to sort of mobilize resources for Europeans collaborating in an institutional setting, is to come up with ideas how we can help accelerate that thinking. So for me, this was a very powerful speech. Lucky us that Mark Carney, as the former governor of a relevant, I think it was then still member state central bank of England, knows very well European thinking, and there has been a very strong coordination, collaboration with Canada under his leadership. So this is, I think, something that in the background now needs to be in the making, because from my perspective, what Europeans need to shift gears on is not analyzing everything that is happening. Trump, by the way, it won't take long until the next big thing will be out, because he will depend on this attention in a World Economic Forum. I mean, he managed to sort of distract from the US economic situation by talking by and large about what he achieved, and then talked about Greenland and all his great ideas. But he'll do the next thing. The next big thing will be coming, and I would be more comfortable if Europeans understood that we need to do a big thing together now. And when there is a board of peace on the one hand, we can say, okay, calmly and quietly, we have a coalition that is called a coalition of the willing in support of Ukraine. That has been, of course, conceived first and foremost on the security question, but there is a lot of exchange going on here, and to develop something in which the European Union can be a building block, as individual member states could, to say in this moment when other leaders across the world, Xi Jinping has been very active over the past couple of years and thinking about and publishing what he feels a global order should look like in future. I mean, to really sketch out, here's our offer. We believe we have credibility. We would do things differently from the United States as it stands right now. And we come forward with a proposal. Europeans, Canadians, other allies, it can start on certain policies and then see whether it gets traction would be a very obvious thing to do.
Yep.
So the work really needs to start in Europe on these matters. And yes, I sense that also when European leaders were presenting in Davos, that there was quite a bit of alignment, less sort of eloquent and less rigorous in sort of self-challenge, because Europeans in Davos were so challenged by others. It would have been a bad choice if von der Leyen, Macron and others would have done, a self-flagellation saying, oh, we got wrong so far. I think for Europeans, it was important to say, here is what we're going to get right. And this is what, European leaders started to kind of convey. But then, to really, really align in this calm way, in the usual way that diplomacy is working, I think this can develop huge attraction. Then, we would entrust ourselves. So my role is not to be optimistic or pessimistic, but I think the implications of what we've seen over the past days is sort of the depth and the scope of things that will start to develop now. Will be different from what we have seen last year.
I want to talk about later about how the EU, specifically in terms of the use of its own tool, prepares for whatever the next shock is. But linking to that point, the other thing Mark Carney said, Fabian, was he warned against what he called naive multilateralism, arguing instead for what he called, I think Alexander Stubb actually coined this phrase, the Finnish president, value-based realism and a coalition that works issue by issues, using the model. He mentioned Ukraine and the coalition of the willing as an example of that. But he also said what I would call the quiet bit out loud, which I thought was quite astonishing. He said, we knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false. And the examples he gave, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules are enforced asymmetrically, that international law is applied, as he called it, with varying rigour, depending on which countries were involved. I mean, this was, he said it was a useful fiction. What are the implications of acknowledging that to a degree it was always a fiction, if you agree that it was? And when you talk about building the coalitions of the future, what does all this mean? Is that it for multilateralism, fundamentally? Has he just written the epitaph of multilateralism? Fabian first, and then Janis.
And linking this also to the previous discussion, which Almut was mentioning, I think it's important. It's very hard for us to disagree with what he was asking for, because in many ways that is precisely what we've been asking for. Whether we're talking about coalitions of the willing, whether we're talking about also this idea of an economic security alliance, which is precisely along the lines of like-minded countries coming together and working together on these topics. So the direction of travel is definitely the right one. Now, that does not mean that this is without risk, or that this is replacing the kind of instruments we have created. And I think we need to be very honest again that when we are talking about these instruments, we're not just talking about the global instruments. We are also talking about the regional instruments we have created, the European Union and NATO, which are also part of this consideration. And there, I think it is maybe in the spirit of the pragmatism which was mentioned, is I think we have to retain whatever is useful and whatever we can, but at the same time not being naive that certain things are just simply not going to function in this new world. So yes, we still will have a global multilateral system, but how well that will function, what topics it will cover, whether it will be effective in achieving some of the goals which are there, I think is a big question. And I would say we need new mechanisms to replace a lot of those functions. Now, has that been a fiction or not a fiction? I think you can argue both ways. There are some elements which have, of course, not been applied consistently. But on the other hand, there was at least a framework of some common rules which people more or less followed, and which you could refer to also as a standard. But in many ways, it doesn't matter because what matters is what is happening now.
Okay. Janis, I mean, he could have, when he talked about multilateralism, he could also have been talking about the EU itself. Because when he talked about strongest would exempt themselves when convenient and things being applied with varying rigor, this goes back to arguments about during Eurozone crises. It's quite different when it's a small member state versus one of the bigs. That was one of the big, huge criticisms of the implementation of the Stability and Growth Pact, for example. Is it wise, therefore, even if he says it's a fiction, but it served us all well, is it wise to have, if you like, openly said, or would you agree with Fabian that it's still important that we have common rules, or has he fundamentally sort of hit it below the waterline, as it were, by admitting it doesn't really, it's not as fair as it was intended to be?
I don't interpret what Fabian said that contradicts what Mark Carney said. There is still a value in having rules, and there's a value of the multilateral order, which, by the way, is not fully dead. It is in deep crisis, and it needs to be rethought. By the way, this is something we have been discussing for 5 or 10 or 15 years, that it needs to be rethought in a changing global environment. So that's nothing new. But the fact that he told us we need to be honest about some of the malfunctions of the previous system is something which we need to be. We need to be honest about that. Now, you were referring to some internal dynamics in the EU during the Euro crisis. There's a lot of criticism in the so-called Global South towards European actions and reactions in the past. And they are being critical of us, and then sometimes we shy away from accepting that criticism. We don't engage even in these fora where this criticism is being expressed. And actually, we should put the mirror in front of ourselves and ask ourselves, where do we get things wrong? In order also, one, to understand why others think differently of us, but most importantly, to actually do things differently within the European Union among member states. So there's a lot of good reasons to have this self-critical stance and to put the mirror in front of us, and that's what Mark Carney was telling us to do. Having said all that, there is a bit of a, there was so much excitement about the Mark Carney speech. But when you listen to people who were in the room when Donald Trump was giving his speech, and he was saying things which were incredible. Now, maybe not surprising, but still incredible. What he was saying about Denmark, what he was saying about Greenland was below a level of what you could express. Even for him, it was a very low level, despite him arguing, I love Denmark. It's a great country. We will find a compromise. But what he was saying about them and also about Europeans was a disgrace. Did the room really react to that? No, it didn't react negatively to it. There was no booing in the room. So on the one hand, we're saying Mark Carney is having a strong position. He's pushing back. He's saying the truth that need to be said. And actually, we argue that Trump respects him more than others because he is so truthful. But do we, and now I mean we, not only as the leadership of the EU, but we collectively, including business leaders who sit in front of Trump and political leaders in Davos, do we actually push back? Are we ready to go the way Mark Carney is asking us to go? And I am very doubtful that we're ready to do so. And also when he's talking about what I would call differentiated cooperation, including coalitions of the willing among middle powers. And you see what Canada is doing and what his government is doing. Are we as EU 27, first of all, 27 is a number we will not reach never again, I think, for at least some time being. So it's 27 minus X always. But even the 27 minus X, are they ready to go along the way of what he is doing? It's the right thing to do, yes. Is his analysis correct? And as Fabian was saying, it goes very much in line with what we have been saying in the past. But are we actually, as EU27, ready to do so? And we need to ask that question again, going back to the beginning, because that's the start of putting the mirror in front of us and asking what is wrong, also with respect to our system. And to ask the more deep, the more in depth. This is not about being critical, it's about being honest in order to actually move things in the right direction. This is not about optimism and pessimism. It's about what needs to be done, the realism which Mark Carney is asking us to have in mind. And I doubt that we have it, going back to the debate about the Rubicon.
Almut, on external relations and what the EU does internally, you referred at the beginning to Mercosur and what happened in the European Parliament this week. One of the things Mark Carney was talking about was working coalitions that work issue by issue with partners who share enough common ground to act together to create a dense web of connections across trade, investment, and culture. Is that the model we should be following? And in that logic, that diversification of trade, deals like the Mercosur deal, we have the EU-India summit coming up next week. Again, is that an example of where you think we should be following the Carney model, but we're not, because in reality, the politics gets in the way? But also in terms of us internally, you said earlier, we really should be focusing on what we should be doing, not what others are doing. What for you is key here?
The Mercosur vote in the European Parliament was extraordinary. It should not have happened. I'm still asking myself, how did it happen? I was involved in a previous life in shaping majorities and making sure then when it all comes together in a plenary, in my context in German federalism, you have to be prepared and know whether you have your majority straight or not. And that is a lot of work. And everybody knows that. And there were even national politicians, speaking to members of parliament, etc. The sheer fact that even from those that are supporting the Commission, many that didn't vote in support, and others that would very much care, the Green Party, about Europe's clout in the world, acknowledging the need to stand together in this dire moment. I mean, this was a tight vote, and it is an absolute disaster. It happened. It shows also there are structural problems in the EU system, which we addressed. Janis, I remember in our early days as analysts, when it was all about constitutional, institutional engineering, how do you make sure that there is a certain responsiveness that goes beyond what is in the treaty between the majorities in parliament that are carrying essentially the European Commission in terms of majorities? I mean, this floating sort of environment is no longer compatible with what leaders in the European Council have to build every day in their national environments. This is damaging for the European Parliament. This is damaging for the supranational institutions. And frankly, what Europe should do now is really be very firm in basically going for preliminary implementation and hope that business will follow and won't find this as a kind of, too unpredictable environment to engage in. Mercosur needs to fly. I mean, next is the free trade agreement with India.
Yeah.
On substance is less sort of concern about the agricultural elements in it, but this cannot go wrong. So The EU and its members need to throw all political resources at making this succeed now, and it has gotten more difficult after the vote on Mercosur. So a lot of the things, Jacki, and I get to your question, whether what Mark Carney suggested, was going to be guardrails or guiding lines. Yes, by all means, but I think a lot of work for Europe has to start at home now on this. We know, interestingly, Draghi was in Berlin earlier this week or last week, I don't remember. He has gotten no traction in the past with his report. The Germans are in Rome today with a big delegation. And, there needs to be work on the competitiveness piece that is very tangible. And that is, we know what we need to do, and it needs to be done. And Europeans still have room to shape majorities. They just have to pay attention. Nobody seemed to have paid enough attention on the vote in the European Parliament. Disastrous.
Fabian, one other point I want to come to, and we haven't got much more time, but I want to talk about how the EU prepares for future shocks of the type that Trump delivered over Greenland in this era of great power politics, in this era of Trump unpredictability driving the agenda. Trump has a great affection for using tariffs for political aims, and hence the threat to several member states to use tariffs in the Greenland issue. Given that, should the EU's focus now be on doing the same? For example, they had begun to dust off, and we talked earlier about disagreements about whether you use this so-called anti-coercion instrument. What should the EU be doing to prepare? Is it about he likes to use tariffs, we should use tariffs? Or does it need to do something different? You said, and Janis also said earlier, you need to hit him where it hurts him at home, because if it hurts him at home, he will do something. What are the implications of that? Does that mean, yes, hit him with economics because that hurts him most? What's the tactics now? A couple of minutes from you, and Janis, then we'll have to close.
It's difficult to answer that in a couple of minutes.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's also because it's not a single answer. I think one of the crucial things Europe has to realize is conceptually, we have to recognize where we are and then be ready to also react. So the talk, for example, of now, which is relaxing again, which is saying, well, that danger has passed. That's exactly the wrong way to go. Secondly, we have to look at the instruments we have. Some of them were designed as defensive instruments. So they are not there to do the same thing as he's doing. It's not attacking, but it is using them to react. But we need to think more about how we already react to threats, because this is how he works. He uses threats to trigger a reaction. So we need to also already know what we are going to do when we have these threats. We need to do this together. We need to be much better coordinated, need to think about beforehand, before it happens, what we are going to do together. We need something, as I've argued, like the Economic Security Alliance, so we can bring like-minded countries together across the world, not just in Europe. So there are many things we can do, but what in the end all of these have in common is that we have to have the political will to do that, and to also go to our populations and say, this is potentially going to cost us. Yeah. This is not painless. This is something where we will also provoke a reaction from him. And the better we are at hitting him where it hurts, which is in particular, I think at this moment in time, through the economic system, through prices in the US, but the more we are going to hurt him, the more he's going to react. So we have to be ready for that.
And that linking this to the conversation we were having about the Mark Carney speech, when he talked about being honest about the world as it is, honest with the public as much as honest with ourselves. Janis, a final thought from you on how the EU prepares. I'm very struck by what Fabian said about we need to know how to react, because the EU machine is not traditionally one that moves fast enough to cope with these one day, the unpredictability of all of this. Where do you think the focus needs to be to get ready for the next crisis, whether it be in Greenland or somewhere else?
Three very good points. One, there was one element of the Carney speech we didn't cite, but the German chancellor cited, when Carney said it's not only about the power of values, it's about the value of power. So that means we need to strengthen ourselves. That needs to be number one. and independently do that. Number two, when it comes to tariffs, if we have to retaliate, we must retaliate and be ready to retaliate. But we need to also make sure that we keep some powder because we don't have so many elements where we can push back. But by the way, if we would be forced to retaliate in terms of tariffs because of the tariff issues, that will also hurt him at home. Because the affordability crisis is something which is really hurting him in the internal debate, and it plays into that. Third point, we need to expect the unexpected and listen carefully to him. Everyone says it was a slip of tongue when he 3 or 4 times during his speech referred to Iceland instead of Greenland. Do we know whether there's something in the back of their heads? Okay, now I'm referring to this in order to link it to something else. And I should have said that earlier when you asked me about Zelensky and why he was critical of the European Union or of Europeans. Enlargement. We need to really become serious with respect to enlargement. Iceland is a case in point. And when we were saying, and I'll stop with that, in test of time, speedy Big Bang enlargement might become an option if geopolitics push us in this direction. When we put it in there, I was doubtful that should be the thing we should be thinking potential of, not as a scenario, but as an option. But now I'm thinking about that more. And I'm asking myself whether if we get to the point where we're ready to think about enlargement in concrete terms and not only about Montenegro, and if Washington and Trump and his administration push back, what do we do? Question mark.
Okay. And we will come back to that. And you've all talked about the importance of strengthening ourselves. That is what EU leaders are going to talk about at their next gathering on February the 12th, when they will be focusing on strengthening the single market, on competitiveness, strategic autonomy. We will be back the day after that summit to analyze the outcome of their discussions. And I will be asking the question again, whether we are putting ourselves on the road to strengthening ourselves, which you've all underlined is really at the core. If we don't do that, then we cannot respond to this new world order in which we live. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for convening at emergency. This was an emergency update to respond to an emergency summit. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And despite the turmoil in the world, I wish you a peaceful weekend. Thanks very much. See you next time.
Thank you.